The desert remembers her still. When the wind sighs through the mesquite trees and the sun bleeds red over the rocks, you can almost see her shadow walking. Tall, silent, half myth, half woman. They used to call her the Giant Apache Woman. A creature too strong to be loved, too proud to be broken. But those who ever saw her eyes, even once, said there was thunder hiding behind them. Not anger, but ache. Her name was Tallulah, and before she was a legend whispered in saloons and campfires, she was just a girl who learned too early that in this world, gentleness is a luxury you have to earn. She was born when the mountains still remembered the sound of drums, and smoke curled from the fires of her people. Her mother died, bringing her into the world, and the women of the tribe wrapped her in deer skin and placed her in her grandmother's arms. The old woman looked at the infant and said the spirits had sent her something powerful, too powerful, perhaps for her own good. Tallulah grew fast, grew strong. By the time she could walk, her feet were already calloused from the hot sand. By the time she could speak, her voice carried the firmness of a storm that had been waiting years to fall. Her grandmother taught her to track the wind, to know which snakes would bite and which would hide. She learned the taste of sagebrush, the sound of coyotes calling each other across miles of emptiness. The desert was her teacher and her mirror. It never gave more than it took, and it never apologized for its beauty. When she was 13, she could lift a full water barrel alone. By 16, she was taller than most men, her shoulders broad and her stride unbroken. Some called her blessed. Others whispered that no man would dare take her hand. But she didn't care for whispers. The wind had taught her something truer, that a woman's worth is not in her softness, but in her survival. She hunted wild horses once, chased them barefoot across a dry plain until one stumbled and fell. Instead of breaking it, she helped it stand again, whispering to it in her language. When it finally rode with her, the tribe called her Spirit of Thunder. But that name brought both awe and distance. The men admired her from afar, like they admired the lightning, beautiful but dangerous to touch. One summer, a sickness took her grandmother. The old woman's voice faded like a dying wind, leaving Tallulah alone in a world that had no place for women like her. She buried her with her own hands and sang the old songs alone. That night, under a bowl of endless stars, she wept for the first time since childhood. The desert didn't comfort her. It just watched, ancient, indifferent, as if reminding her that grief, too, was part of being alive. She could have stayed in the mountains, a spirit among ruins, but the hunger to see more pushed her south. She followed the dry riverbeds until the sand gave way to wooden fences and dust roads, until she found the edge of the white man's world. The town of Iron Bluff was loud and alive, a place of gun smoke, whiskey, and restless souls. Tallulah walked through its streets, and silence followed her like a ghost. Children pointed. Men whispered. Women stared, clutching their husbands' arms. She tried to buy bread at the general store, but the man behind the counter wouldn't meet her eyes. He just dropped the loaf on the counter and muttered something about monsters that walked like men. She left without saying a word. She'd learned long ago that silence cuts deeper than shouting ever could. At the edge of town stood a saloon, the Broken Spur. From inside came laughter, music, and the heavy scent of sweat and liquor. She was about to pass when a voice called out, half mocking, half curious. A tall rancher leaned on the doorway, his hat tilted low, a silver spur catching the last bit of sun. "So you're her," he said with a smirk. "The Giant Apache Woman. The one who wrestles stallions and scares men out of their boots." She didn't answer. He stepped closer, eyes tracing her like she was some kind of legend brought to life. "They say no man's strong enough for you," he laughed. "Is that true?" Her gaze didn't waver. "No man's been patient enough," she said softly, turning to leave. The saloon roared with laughter behind her as she walked away. But if they'd seen her face in that moment, they would have known there was no pride in her eyes. Only sorrow, the kind that comes when you realize strength has become your prison. That night, she camped on the edge of the desert, where the earth met the sky and the stars felt close enough to touch. The wind played with her hair as she built a small fire. She watched the flames dance and thought of the man's laughter, of how quickly people turn legends into entertainment. She looked at her hands, scarred, strong, beautiful in their own way, and wondered if anyone would ever hold them without fear. She whispered to the spirits of her ancestors, asking if strength was meant to be carried alone. But the desert gave no answer. Only the coyotes howled back, carrying her question into the black horizon. Days turned to weeks. She roamed from one settlement to another, working for food, breaking wild horses, cutting wood, mending fences. Wherever she went, stories followed, stories bigger than truth, louder than her own voice. They called her the woman who lifted wagons, the warrior who outran bullets. And each tale, though meant to honor her, pushed her further from being human. One evening, as she rode along a dry canyon, a storm began to form on the horizon. Clouds gathered like bruises, thunder grumbled low. She found shelter beneath an overhang and watched the lightning crawl across the sky. In that light, her reflection shimmered faintly on a pool of rainwater, a face carved by wind and memory. She realized then how long it had been since someone had looked at her and seen her, not the legend. She missed laughter that wasn't cruel, eyes that didn't measure her worth in muscle or myth. She missed gentleness, that fragile thing her world had never offered her. When the storm passed, she stepped into the open desert again, the earth smelling of rain and dust. The sun rose behind her, spilling gold across the land. She walked until her shadow stretched long before her, a giant among the stones. And in that moment, she understood something her grandmother had once whispered, that the earth gives us the shape we need to survive, but the heart must still find its own way home. She stood there for a long time, letting the wind braid through her hair, letting the silence hold her. The world saw her as a mountain, unshakable, unmoving. But mountains, too, crumble over time. Even stone weeps, though it takes 1,000 years to show its tears. The towns would remember her name, but not her truth. They'd turn her into a story told by men over whiskey, a story about a woman too wild to be tamed. And maybe that's how she wanted it. Because beneath the thunder, beneath the dust and the weight of every whisper, Tallulah carried a secret hope. That somewhere out there, beyond all the noise and the fear, someone would see her not as a giant to conquer, but as a woman to understand. She rode into the dusk that night, the desert wind following her like an old friend. Her horse's hooves beat softly against the earth, each thud echoing the rhythm of a heart still waiting to be seen. And so began the legend of the Giant Apache Woman. Stronger than steel, lonelier than the sky. A soul forged by desert heat and heartbreak. A woman who believed no man was strong enough to stand beside her. Not yet, but the desert, old as time itself, already knew. Her story was far from over. The wind carried her name across the horizon, whispering to anyone who dared to listen. Tallulah, the woman the earth itself had raised. The desert does not rush its lessons. It waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it sends someone to test what you have learned. For Tallulah, that test came wearing spurs and a smile that shone like polished brass. She met him again by chance, Caleb Boone, the same man who once mocked her outside the saloon in Iron Bluff. Months had passed since that day, and she had long buried his laughter in the dust behind her. But fate, cruel and curious, has a way of circling back like a hawk that never really left the sky. He rode into the small trading post where she'd been hauling lumber for a few coins. The sun was low, the air thick with the smell of sweat and horses. He saw her loading the last of the beams, her arms glistening, her face half hidden beneath her hat. And he grinned like a man who'd just spotted a gold vein in a riverbed. Didn't expect to find a giant woman doing man's work, he said. But then, you never did know your place, did you? She didn't answer. The silence between them stretched like dry leather. Then he leaned against his saddle and said he had an offer, one that would make her famous, maybe even rich. He owned a traveling Wild West show, a parade of gunslingers, trick riders, and snake charmers that wandered from one dusty town to another. He said he wanted her to join, to show her strength, to let folks see what the desert could make of a woman. He promised food, pay, and a place where people would cheer instead of stare. For a moment, Tallulah said nothing. The idea of applause, of being admired instead of feared, brushed softly against her heart like a tender wind. And she thought, maybe this was a way to rewrite her story, to turn mockery into marvel. So she went. The show moved from town to town, tents rising at dawn, laughter echoing by nightfall. Children gasped when she lifted barrels and broke ropes with her bare hands. Women whispered behind fans, men shouted for more. And for a while, she believed she'd found something close to belonging. Caleb introduced her on stage as the Great Apache Woman, the desert goddess of strength. He wore that showman's charm like a second skin, winking at the crowd, spinning tales bigger than truth. He said she had once wrestled a bear to save her tribe, that her tears could split stone, that she'd been kissed by lightning itself. Each night, she smiled on cue, flexed her arms, bent steel rods, and bowed to the roaring applause. But when the lights dimmed and the tents emptied, she sat alone by the dying fire, feeling smaller than she'd ever been. They didn't clap for her. They clapped for the story he made of her. And that story was a cage. Caleb grew rich off the spectacle. He bought finer boots, a silver buckle, and a new revolver he liked to show off after each performance. He'd swagger in her tent, toss a handful of coins on the table, and say she should be grateful. No one else would pay to see a woman like her. She would stare at the coins, the small pile of glittering metal, and wonder what her grandmother would think. The woman who taught her that strength was sacred, not something to be sold by the pound. One night, after a show in a town called Bitter Creek, he stumbled in her tent, drunk and smiling that same sly smile he'd worn the first day he saw her. He told her she needed to be softer, that audiences liked beauty more than power. He told her to wear a dress that showed her shoulders, to laugh more, to bow deeper. She stood still as stone. Then he stepped closer and pressed his hand against her cheek, saying maybe she just needed a real man to remind her she was still a woman. She didn't move, didn't speak. The air between them turned sharp, heavy with something that wasn't quite violence, but wasn't far from it either. When he leaned in, she turned her face away. He laughed, low and bitter. "You'll die alone," he said, "if you keep thinking you're stronger than every man alive." That night, she packed her things. No farewell, no anger, just quiet resolve. She left before dawn, her shadow long across the sand, her heart cold and clear. The desert greeted her like an old friend, empty, harsh, honest. And for the first time in months, she could breathe. She walked for days, sleeping beneath stars that blinked like slow tears. Her boots cracked, her hands blistered, but her spirit felt lighter with each mile. In a small, half-forgotten town, she stopped by a creek to rest her horse. There she found a young mare tangled in barbed wire, its side bleeding. Without thinking, she knelt beside it, whispering softly, untangling the cruel metal bit by bit. When the horse finally stood, trembling but alive, she pressed her forehead to its neck and whispered a prayer of thanks to the spirits. It followed her for miles after that, as if the desert had finally given her a companion. The road stretched endless, winding through ghost towns and lonely plains. She passed an old church, its bell rusted and silent, and buried a small child's doll she found half buried in the dust. A small gesture for a soul forgotten by time. Each act of kindness, however small, softened the hard edges inside her. The strength that once felt like armor began to feel like a blessing again. By the time she reached the canyon lands, her silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was peaceful. One evening, she found herself following the faint sound of hammering, slow, steady, honest. She came upon a small homestead nestled against the red rock. Nothing more than a cabin, a corral, and a man fixing a broken fence. He didn't startle when he saw her. Didn't stare or smirk or speak her name like a rumor. He simply nodded once and said she could water her horse if she wished. His voice was low, calm, like a stream hidden under stone. His eyes were tired but kind. She watered the mare, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something gentler, something she hadn't felt in years. He returned to his work, humming softly. The hammer's rhythm matched the beat of her heart, slow, certain, unafraid. When she thanked him, he said only, "You're welcome, ma'am," then went back to mending the fence, as if the world hadn't just shifted a little. That night, she camped near the canyon. The wind was cool, the stars low and silver. She thought of Caleb's laughter, the way his words had tried to shrink her. Then she thought of the quiet cowboy, how he'd spoken to her without hunger or pity. It felt like the first real kindness she'd known in a long, long time. As the fire crackled, she whispered to the night, "Maybe no man is strong enough for me, but maybe I don't need strong. Maybe I just need steady." The desert breathed around her, silent and alive. And somewhere in that endless stretch of wild land, the first ember of something soft began to glow, small, fragile, but real. In the weeks that followed, she wandered near the canyon often. She'd see him from a distance, working the land, quiet and sure. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he'd leave a jug of water by the fence line before sundown, and she'd find it there without a word exchanged. It wasn't courtship. It wasn't friendship. It was something older, two souls circling the same fire without daring to step closer. The world had mocked her strength, tried to profit from it, tried to break it. But now, in the quiet rhythm of days and distance, she felt something returning, a kind of peace that didn't need applause. Her muscles still carried storms, but her heart began to carry calm. And though she didn't know his name yet, she felt the earth whisper it softly in the wind. A name that would soon become part of her story, part of her healing, part of the legend the desert would never forget. So the giant Apache woman rode once more into the dusk, her horse's mane glinting like fire, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun melted into gold. Behind her, the circus lights of Caleb Boone's world faded into nothing. Ahead of her lay silence, truth, and perhaps, though she dared not name it yet, the beginning of love. The desert had tested her pride, and she had passed. Now, it was ready to teach her tenderness. The desert has its own way of bringing souls together, not through noise or chance, but through silence. It does not shout its answers. It simply lets two paths cross beneath the same sky and waits to see what they will make of it. For Tallulah, that crossing came again one morning beneath a pale dawn that smelled of dust and dew. She was gathering firewood near the canyon ridge when she saw him, the quiet cowboy from before. He was mending a fence, same as last time, slow and patient, his shirt sleeves rolled, his hat shadowing eyes that seemed carved from calm. He looked up when her horse snorted softly. This time he smiled, a small thing, shy and sure, like sunlight finding its way through clouds. She nodded once in return, and that was all. No words, no need. When she turned to leave, he called after her, gentle as wind through grass. "Fence runs long," he said. "Could use an extra pair of hands, if you've got the time." She hesitated, not from pride, but from unfamiliarity. It had been so long since anyone had asked her for help without making her smaller first. She dismounted, tied her horse to a post, and walked toward him. The boards creaked beneath her weight, the air thick with quiet understanding. And so, without fanfare, they worked together, hammer and nail, plank and dust, breath and stillness. Hours passed, the sun climbing and falling again. They didn't speak much. Only the sound of wood splitting and nails striking filled the air. But something about that silence felt right. Not heavy, not awkward, just steady. When the fence was finished, he wiped his brow and offered her water from a tin cup. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch was small, almost nothing, but it carried the warmth of something long missing. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Name's Eli," he murmured. She smiled faintly, the first real smile in months. "Tallulah," she said, and the way he repeated it, slow, respectful, made it sound like a prayer. Days turned to a rhythm. She would return to help him now and then, not because she had to, but because the quiet between them felt like home. Sometimes she fixed the corral, sometimes she gathered water, sometimes she just sat and watched him work. He spoke little, But every word he did speak carried weight. Honest words, clean and without cruelty. One evening, as the light turned copper and the wind whispered low, he brewed coffee over the fire and offered her a tin cup. She sat across from him, the canyon stretching vast and golden behind them. "You don't talk much," she said softly. "Don't need to," he replied. "The land says enough for both of us." She laughed quietly, a sound like dry river stones rolling in the wind. It startled even her. Eli glanced at her then, not in surprise, not in awe, just in quiet admiration. "That a good sound," he said. She looked down, hiding a blush the desert light could not hide. That night, as the fire burned low, he spoke again, voice softer now. "Had a wife once," he said. "She and the boy died 2 winters back. Fever." He stared into the flames for a long time, the orange glow painting lines of grief across his face. "I used to think strength meant never breaking," he said, "but I learned that sometimes breaking is how the light gets in." Tallulah listened, no words, no pity, just listening the way only someone who's known loss can. Then she said quietly, "The desert breaks us all, but it leaves the strongest parts behind." Their eyes met across the fire. Something unspoken passed between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. 2 storms meeting, finding they no longer needed to rage. Days bled softly into weeks. Tallulah stayed nearby, helping with small chores. Eli never asked her to, but never turned her away either. They moved in the same rhythm now, the rhythm of people who had stopped running from the world and started tending to it again. One morning, she found a wild foal caught in a ravine. She called Eli, and together they freed it, slow, patient, gentle. When the foal stood trembling, Eli stroked its mane and said, "Sometimes they just need to know they ain't alone." Tallulah watched him, her heart swelling with something that wasn't pride, wasn't longing, something quieter, truer, a kind of peace she'd never thought she'd find. At night, they sat by the fire, sharing simple food, beans, coffee, sometimes a bit of bread. She told him stories her grandmother once told, of spirits hiding in the wind, of women who spoke to mountains. He listened, his eyes soft, his soul open. Then one night, he said, "Folks around here used to talk about the Giant Apache Woman. Said she was fierce enough to fight thunder." She looked into the fire, the old shame flickering in her chest. "They talked," she said quietly. "That's all they ever did." He nodded. "Let him talk," he said. "Thunder don't answer to whispers." The words sank deep, warm and healing. For the first time, her legend didn't feel like a curse. It felt like something sacred again. A storm rolled in a few days later, not the kind that knocks politely. This one came howling from the mountains, carrying dust and memory. They barely made it to a cave before the sky tore open. Inside, it was dark, save for a flicker of lightning outside. Rain beat the earth in waves, the sound deafening, primal. Tallulah sat with her back to the wall, breathing slow. The storm didn't frighten her. Storms never did, but the nearness of another person did. It had been so long since she'd allowed anyone close. Eli sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just there. His calm was its own kind of strength. The wind screamed through the cave mouth, and for a moment she trembled, not from fear, but from remembering every man who had ever tried to own her. And then, in the heart of that sound, she felt Eli's hand find hers, slow, steady, wordless. He didn't grip or guide. He just held, the way one might hold a fragile truth. They sat like that as the storm raged, the thunder echoing through their chests like a heartbeat too big for either to bear alone. By dawn, the world had gone quiet again. The desert glistened under a film of rain, every cactus shining like glass. They walked back to the ranch in silence, side by side, their shadows long and touching. At the corral, Eli turned to her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile. "Guess the storm passed," he said. She looked at him, her eyes soft as morning. "Maybe it just moved inside instead," she murmured. In the days that followed, something subtle changed. They still worked side by side, still spoke little, but every glance lingered a breath longer. Every touch, handing tools, passing bread, held a quiet electricity. There was no rush, no confession, no need for names to turn into promises. Only peace, the kind you earn after surviving your own legend. She found herself laughing again, softly, rarely but real. He found himself watching her, not as a marvel, not as a myth, but as a woman whose strength had made her beautiful, not frightening. Sometimes, as dusk fell, he would hum an old tune, and she would close her eyes, letting the sound wrap around her like a blanket. It wasn't love yet, but it was the beginning of understanding, the soil from which love could grow. And when she rode out alone one evening to watch the sunset, she realized she was no longer running from her name. The Giant Apache Woman was still her, the warrior, the wanderer. But she was also Tallulah, the woman who could build fences, share coffee, hold a man's hand through a storm. The desert had made her strong. But kindness, quiet, patient kindness, was making her whole. That night, as the stars rose one by one over the canyon, she looked toward Eli's cabin and whispered to the wind, "Maybe this is what I was always meant to find. Not someone stronger, just someone still." The wind carried her words out into the open sky, and the desert, old and knowing, kept its silence. For it already understood what she was only beginning to see, that some hearts don't collide. They align. He didn't understand right away, but he smiled anyway, and that was enough. The summer burned longer than most that year. Even the wind seemed tired, dragging its feet through the dust. Tallulah felt it deep in her bones, a quiet before something vast, something waiting. Eli had been mending the south corral when word came. A group of men from the nearby town, ranchers mostly, were talking loud again. About her. They called her unnatural. A woman who worked like a man. A woman who needed taming. The same word she'd heard before, spoken by smaller souls who feared what they could not name. But this time they carried guns. That evening, Eli rode out to find her near the ridge. He dismounted slowly, dust rising around him in tired halos. "They're coming," he said softly. "Best you stay close tonight." She looked at him, steady, unflinching. "I've hidden long enough." He shook his head. "You don't owe them your fury, Tallulah." She smiled, a sad, knowing thing. "Maybe not my fury, but maybe they need to see what strength really looks like." Eli didn't argue. He just stayed by her side as the last light sank into the desert. Night fell heavy. The stars blinked awake, scattered like embers across a black sea. And from the distance came the sound. Hooves, rough voices, laughter too cruel to be human. Tallulah stood tall, her shadow stretched wide under the moon. Eli beside her, rifle slung but calm, eyes sharp as flint. The riders appeared out of the dark, their lanterns swinging like restless ghosts. At their front rode a man she remembered too well, Boone Carver, the one who'd once mocked her strength before the saloon crowd years ago. "Well, I'll be," he sneered. "The giant herself. Didn't think you'd be hiding behind a man now." Eli said nothing. His silence was heavier than any threat. Tallulah stepped forward, her voice low and even. "You came looking for thunder, Boone. Let's see if you can stand the rain." The desert seemed to hold its breath. Boone spat to the side, his grin twisting. "You think this land's yours? You think you can scare men, just cause you swing an axe, and wear your pride like a crown?" She took one step closer. "I don't scare men. They scare themselves." A murmur rippled through the others, doubt creeping in. The air shimmered with heat and memory. Then Boone lifted his rifle. Eli moved first, not to shoot, but to stand in front of her. For a heartbeat, everything froze, the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm chooses where to strike. Then thunder rolled. A flash. A gunshot. The sound echoed through the canyon like a scream torn from the earth. Boone's rifle fired wide, hitting the ground near Eli's boot. Eli didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He raised his gaze, calm and cutting, and said only, "That's enough." Maybe it was the way he said it. Maybe it was the way Tallulah didn't move, didn't cower. But something in that moment broke the fever of the mob. The men shifted uneasily. One of them muttered, "We didn't come for blood, Boone." Boone snarled, ready to shout. But then his horse reared, startled by the echoing thunder that cracked the night again. The beast bolted, dragging Boone halfway through the sand before throwing him down. When he rose, the others were already backing away, shaken. No one fired another shot. No one dared. When silence returned, it was deeper than before. Eli lowered his rifle, breathing slow. Tallulah stood still for a long time, her heart steady, her face unreadable. "You all done now?" she called after them, her voice carrying like wind across water. The men didn't answer. They just rode off into the dark, leaving their noise behind. And when the last hoofbeat faded, Tallulah finally let her breath go. Eli looked at her, that same quiet gaze, full of something stronger than fear or pride. "You didn't need me out there," he said softly. She turned to him, eyes glinting with firelight and tears. "Maybe not, but I wanted you there. That's new for me." They sat beside the fire that night, the desert humming low around them. Eli's hand brushed hers, not in hunger, but in peace. "You were right," he said. "Thunder don't answer to whispers." She smiled faintly. "And storms don't ride alone." For the first time in years, her laughter came easy, not forced, not defensive, just free. Days later, the story spread. Not the cruel version the town used to tell, but a different one. About a woman who faced a dozen men without flinching. About the cowboy who stood beside her, quiet as the earth itself. They called her again the Giant Apache Woman, but now the name carried reverence, not ridicule. A symbol, not a warning. And she didn't correct them. Because legends, she realized, aren't lies. Their truths stretched wide enough to hold a lifetime. Seasons turned. The rains came, soft and rare, painting the desert green for the first time in memory. Tallulah and Eli worked the land together, not as master and helper, but as equals, two halves of a whole rhythm. At night, when the coyotes sang and the fire whispered, she'd rest her head on his shoulder and feel his heartbeat like distant thunder, steady, unending. Sometimes he'd look at her and say, "Never met anyone stronger." And she'd answer, "You don't have to be strong when someone finally sees you." He'd nod, that half-smile curling slow. Maybe that's what love really is, seeing someone and not looking away. Years later, long after time had softened their edges, the townsfolk would still tell her story. Children would whisper about the giant woman who stood taller than fear, whose heart beat in rhythm with the storm. But those who'd truly known her, those who'd sat by her fire and heard her laugh, would tell a gentler version. They'd say she was just a woman who learned that strength isn't the absence of softness. It's the courage to be both. One twilight, when the sun burned low and gold dust hung like smoke in the air, Eli stood at the porch and watched her ride home across the plain. The wind lifted her hair, the light caught her eyes, and for a moment, she looked like something out of the world's first dream. When she dismounted, he said quietly, "You still think no man's strong enough for you?" She smiled, slow and tender. "No, Eli. I think maybe I just needed to find one who didn't need to be." That night, under a silver moon, she whispered a prayer to the desert that had both raised and tested her. "Thank you," she said, "for breaking me, for remaking me." And far off, the wind answered in soft, echoing tones, not words, but something like approval, as if the land itself was proud. The next morning, her laughter rolled across the canyon again, bright, unguarded, alive. And those who heard it swore it sounded like rain after a long drought. Because it was. So if you're listening to this now, my friend, remember her. Remember that the world will always try to measure your worth in the weight of your silence. But strength, true strength, is the quiet that follows after you've spoken your truth. And maybe, like Tallulah, you'll find someone who doesn't want to outmatch your fire. Just sit beside it. If her story moved you, don't leave quietly. Tell me in the comments. From where in this wide, wild world are you listening tonight? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so we can keep sitting together by this old storytelling fire, and remembering what it means to be strong, and soft, and still human.